well, thank you all so much for joining us for Northeast Native Plant Primer, 235 Plants for an Earth-Friendly Garden. Uli Lorimer is here to discuss his new book, the aforementioned Northeast Native Plant Primer, 235 Plants for an Earth-Friendly Garden. A little bit about the book. You can bring your garden to life and life to your garden. Do you want a garden that makes a real difference? Choose plants native to our Northeast region. The rewards will benefit you, your yard, and the environment. Native plant expert Uli Lorimer of the Native Plant Trust makes adding these superstar plants easier than ever before with proven advice that every home gardener can follow. This incomparable source book includes 235 recommended native trees, shrubs, vines, ferns, wildflowers, grasses, sedges, and annuals. It's everything you need to know to create a beautiful and beneficial garden. And this is a must-have handbook for gardeners in Massachusetts. Uli was telling me it was recently number 6 of all the books for the independent bookstores in Massachusetts. So a little bit about Uli. Uli Lorimer is the Director of Horticulture at Native Plant Trust. He is a tireless advocate for native plants in public gardens, the designed landscape, and those found in the wild. Founded in 1900 as the Society for the Protection of Native Plants, the Native Plant Trust is the nation's oldest plant conservation organization and a recognized leader in native plant conservation, horticulture, and education. The Society's headquarters, Garden in the Woods, is a renowned native plant botanic garden in Framingham, Mass. That attracts visitors from all over the world. From this base, 25 staff and more than 700 volunteers work throughout New England to monitor and protect rare and endangered plants, collect and preserve seeds to ensure biological diversity, detect and control invasive species, conduct research, and offer a range of educational programs. All right, I've spoken for too long, Uli. So all 220 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Uli for joining us here tonight. And Uli, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you for such an enthusiastic introduction. I'm going to share my screen so we can get started. And here we are. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening. And also big thanks to the wonderful network of public libraries here in Massachusetts that are helping to sponsor this event, as well as allow me to spread the good word about native plants. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit today about the book and a little bit about the context that brought me to write the book. It's published by Timber Press and it's available now. But a little bit about me. I can credit my green thumb very, very directly to the maternal side of my family, with my grandmother on the left here in Germany and my mother on the right-hand side, and my wife, who I met many years ago at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, where we were both gardeners. And so I have a lot of fond memories. We moved to the US when I was about 5 from Germany, and I remember spending a lot of time in my grandmother's garden and even assisting her in the evenings on her nightly summer slug hunt, where I was handed a pail and a trowel and a flashlight, and we walked around and took care of all the slugs that wanted to come and devour our plants. And so I think that her love of gardening certainly transitioned and translated over to my own mother, who's always had a really great garden, and I've inherited the green thumb. And so growing up, I was always one of those kids that wanted to know the names of plants, wanted to know what was underneath of things. And when we moved to the United States, we moved to Wilmington, Delaware, which was very close to a very world-renowned garden called Longwood Gardens, which is just over the border in Pennsylvania. And so we spent many weekends whenever visitors were in town at Longwood Gardens. You can see my younger self here with my sister. And I'd like to think that all that exposure had an influence on my choice of career and career path. We spent a year in Tucson, Arizona in 3rd grade, which was also a very formative year for me, where I learned that cacti have spines and prickles. and are not fuzzy and are not fun to pet. But I'd like to think that throughout all of those experiences as I became an adult, I never really lost that, boyish enthusiasm for the plant world. And I think that it's still with me today. And during my 14 years as the curator of native flora at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, I often walked around with insects and salamanders and bees, or with bouquets of sedges, because I never lost that enthusiasm, and certainly not a fear of having insects crawling all over you. And it was a useful thing for teaching people the connections between the natural world and all the life that the plants of our planet support. So in putting together this book, I really wanted to write it to be inspirational and hopeful. I think that we're faced with a lot of bad news, and certainly about the environment and about the climate. There's lots of bad news, particularly lately, in other realms of our lives. And so I thought it was really important to present something that didn't just harp on what we already mostly know, but to try to give people a positive direction and empower them to welcome these plants into their gardens and to be inspired by them. And that we really are, we're at a point where we do need to think of ourselves as part of nature and not apart from nature. And embracing that, I think, allows us to create this bridge, as I talk about, that can connect our gardens with all of the wonders of the natural world. The challenges that we face, at least that are somewhat addressed in the book, are exactly what is ecological horticulture, how does it differ from traditional horticulture, and why is it important? It's a little bit of a pushback against our, I would say there's an obsession with things that are neat and tidy, and somewhere along the line, we have been convinced that a garden with clipped hedges and straight lines and a neat garden is one that is orderly and tidy and beautiful. But that approach, unfortunately, is not particularly, it doesn't embrace the wildlife that could live in your garden if you allowed it to be a little bit more messy. I talk a little bit about reducing lawns, and again, this seems to be a subject that is, again, gaining more traction. I'm the father of two small boys, and I very much understand the utility of a lawn. But I do think there's ways in which we can welcome diversity in our lawn. We can certainly lose the fertilizer and the pesticide applications, and maybe even shrink your lawn a little bit, particularly, if you have children that are adults and don't need to run around and scream and play in the backyard, that there are ways to reduce the lawn surface. But also recognize that change comes slowly. When working with plants, you have to accept that we measure success on their timeline, which is seasons and growing seasons in years. And so, having done this profession for nearly 22 years now in public gardens, I have come to understand and appreciate the utility of planning ahead and being patient, and sort of embracing delayed gratification rather than instant gratification. And so a lot of the things that I'm suggesting are things that you can try and see how it works for you, and to enact these changes slowly into your garden, and not necessarily, with the installation mindset of let's just zero out everything that was there before and move forward. So I think that we are at a point where we need to start thinking of gardens as being not only pretty, but functional as well. And I mean ecologically functional. You can have both things. And if there isn't a time that is now to do that, then when? I would say that, there's a lot of momentum around and interest in using native plants right now. And so the message that this book puts forth is very timely. We have seen a real surge in interest in gardening overall, and I would hesitate to say that it is one of the few positives that has come out of a global pandemic. But forcing people to stay home and saying, well, if I can't travel and I can't go on vacation, maybe I could look at my own backyard. Again, if you're fortunate enough to have a backyard or a front yard, and to realize what a enriching and rewarding space that can be. We have heard a lot about over the years about the losses of biodiversity, the losses of wild areas. Again, I haven't been back to Wilmington, Delaware in many, many years. And the last time I was back, I was immediately struck by the lack of those little woodlots that used to be between, the church and the next subdivision, and that everything seemed to be built up and built up. And I think that overall we're continuing to develop these quote unquote natural spaces at quite a staggering pace. And for me, it really emphasizes why design spaces like gardens and commercial spaces are that much more important in ensuring that our ecosystem is functional. There's a lot of anxiety around climate change right now. We don't know what the future will bring. We're unsure of what the weather patterns will bring, whether it will be wet or dry or hot. And I think all of this kind of combined with the news of extinctions and declines in insect numbers and bird numbers and declines in bees and pollinators, all of this kind of amounts to folks wanting to do something positive, something to support our wildlife. And so I think these are all some of the factors that are really driving this surge in interest in gardening. And you can look at that in a couple of different ways. But before I do that, I want to just sort of jump on a little bit of a soapbox, a slight tangent, if you'd like, that involves the idea of biodiversity. And I want to propose a slightly different way to think about it. This beautiful scene here was taken in Kennebunk, and I know that we have somebody who's joined us from Kennebunk right now. This is the Kennebunk Sand Plains, a very special place. If I were to, put on my botanist hat, I could go into this grassland and generate a long list of all the different kinds of things there and say, well, this is a good way to measure how biodiverse this grassland is. There are, let's say, 100 different species of plants in here. I could call my entomologist friends and say, let's survey all of the insects and bees and beetles and butterflies and all the other sorts of things, and we could come up with a number for that. Maybe there's some fungi in here. But the point is that each and every one of those different things, as we measure biodiversity, is weighted equally, no matter if there's only one of them or if there are 10,000 of them. And this is exactly the point that bioproportionality seeks to address. We oftentimes use biodiversity as justification and saying, well, here's a nice flat land that we could build some houses on, but it has 100 different species on it. But we've got 100 species over on this other piece of property over here. And so it's okay because there's still biodiversity over there, even if we plan to make changes to this particular landscape. And the idea of bioproportionality really seeks to ask the question, how many of one thing do you really need in order for that one thing to be able to survive and reproduce and pass on, adaptations that are beneficial, and allow it to adapt to an uncertain future. And so that, I think, it's more of a theoretical question. There isn't a number that you can say, well, you need a minimum of 10,000 of this plant in order for it to be secure, or 100,000. But I do think that we oftentimes in our measure of biodiversity think that as long as there's at least one or a handful or something, that it's weighted just as equally as something that is overly abundant, or even a non-native or invasive species, which some folks will argue have actually increased the biodiversity of New England. At this point, we probably count roughly a third of all of the plants that you can find in New England as non-native to the region. So that's quite a number. And we've had a long history of introducing plants ever since the first Europeans stepped off the boat here. So just some food for thought again, and I think that how that translates to design spaces and to gardens is that these are places where you can make decisions about what kinds of plants to plant and how many of them. And if you decide to plant some native plants and your neighbors do, and maybe the folks the next town over, collectively, you're inching more and closer towards that overall proportion of plants that are really needed in order for them to survive and stay on the landscape. So again, some food for thought. Unfortunately, this did not make it into the book as it was a very new paper that was just published in 2021. But I think it's intriguing enough as a thought to include into this talk. So just to think about that a little bit. So other ways that you can measure the interest in native plants currently, we can take a look at public spaces. And you can take a look at all these different aspects in which the use of native plants is desired. So state DOTs, not just here in Massachusetts, but in Maine and other New England states, are looking at ways to transition mowed roadsides and right-of-ways into pollinator habitat, all of course that requires native plants. Pollinator pathways as more of a grassroots effort, sometimes on a local or municipal scale or township scale. And these are really wonderful groups of folks that are trying to create connectivity between natural spaces and in between neighborhoods so that pollinators have enough resources to travel back and forth and thrive and survive. One of my staff members was successfully involved in a municipal ordinance in the city of Somerville, which has now legislated the use of native plants in public spaces. And so we're really proud of that effort. It was maybe about 3 or 4 years of lobbying and works and meetings with the city and back and forth in order for them to adopt this, but it shows that it is possible. We routinely get questions and requests from solar farms. Do you have a low-growing native pollinator mix that we can use instead of mowing around those? Schools and universities, we've partnered, at least Native Plant Trust has partnered with Smith College to produce native plant seeds on campus and engage their student body in direct plant conservation work and action. Nearly every botanic garden that I could think of has some native plant display or is including more native plants into their displays. National and state parks certainly also jumping on this trend where visitor centers are being landscaped with regionally appropriate native plants. Even shopping centers and corporate parks are beginning to show signs of this. There's a shopping center here in Sudbury that features native grasses and shrubs and some perennials. And I see that as all really positive and showing that you can design commercial spaces that are appropriate and that fit into the surrounding landscapes. In the private space, in the private sphere, we're increasingly seeing more homeowners that are looking to transition their turf and lawns or non-native exotic plantings. This article that's cited here from the Washington Post chronicles the challenges that a particular couple faced in Virginia in wanting to turn their front yard into a pollinator meadow, and the threatening letters and legal action that they faced from the homeowner association because they claimed that their lawn didn't fit in with everybody else's property. So these are real challenges that people feel when you kind of step out of the box a little bit, and it requires a degree of courage to do that. There's a whole new generation of landscape architects and designers now who are really emphasizing ecology as well as aesthetics and the use of regionally appropriate native plants. And I can say that our own public programming and education at Native Plant Trust over the last few years has seen an absolute explosion in interest. Our registration for our courses, I think, was up nearly 50% over last year. So people are beginning to pick up the message. I would have been astounded 10 years ago to see native plants gracing the front covers of major nationally syndicated periodicals like Fine Gardening and Horticulture Magazine. Yet here they are, which kind of is another reason or another way for me that says that, native plants have arrived in a way. Even Forbes Magazine, the last place that you think you would find articles about native plants, has a wonderful little article here about a nursery owner in Tennessee who has transitioned away from their normal offerings to only offering native plants, and was just blown away by the support that the community shows. She's getting involved in restoration efforts with the state, and really has recognized this as a positive direction to go, and so much so that, yes, Forbes magazine is talking about native plants as well. So another way to look at that is to look at how native plant sales have grown. More and more nurseries, garden centers are stocking native plants because customers are demanding them. Here in Massachusetts, we have a couple of brand new native plant nurseries, are relatively new. Blue Stem Natives down in Norwell is relatively new, and they're doing fantastic work. Helia Native Plant Nursery is out in the Berkshires, and at Nasami Farm and Garden of the Woods, where we also sell plants. Last year, we've seen a 30% increase in sales alone. And the last 4 years have seen a pretty remarkable 15-20% growth annually in our plant sales. So people are really demanding this material. And so I think these are really, it's a good and positive development. So in thinking about how to inspire more gardeners to use native plants, I thought about what different ways in which I can help in aside from the recommendations of the specific plants themselves in the introductory chapters. What are the sorts of things that I can impart that might help inspire people? So first, we talk a lot about how to define a native plant. And to some degree, this definition is subjective. You could certainly make an argument that any plant that grows in North America is native to the continent. Is a Colorado blue spruce native to America? Yes, maybe not so to Massachusetts, but it'll grow here. But maybe it doesn't have all of the relationships that it evolved with out in Colorado. Another way to look at how plants are distributed has less to do with, from the plant's perspective, really arbitrary political boundaries that we have imposed on the landscape, and has much more to do with this concept that you see here on your screen now, which are called ecoregions. And ecoregions kind of, they're united by similarities in geology, in soil, in land use, in land cover, and plant community type, and hydrology to some extent, into these broader zones, if you'd like, or regions. And so in Massachusetts, we have 3 different regions. We've got the Northern Highlands region in the western part of the state that shares some similarities, with Vermont and New Hampshire, with the Adirondacks, with the Catskills that you can see as another little green or teal blob in New York State, and certainly down into the Poconos and the ridge and valleys of New Jersey. And then the dark blue, which is the Atlantic coastal pine barrens. So again, if you're familiar with the state here, southern New Jersey has a beautiful pine barrens. The eastern Long Island has pine barrens dominated by pines and oaks, just in the same way that the Cape and the islands have a particular look to them in the plants that are there. And so if you really wanted to be regionally appropriate, you would try to source your plants from within each of these ecoregions. And I recognize that's a challenge. Many nurseries don't know where their plants come from to begin with. So I'm content at this stage to introduce the idea to folks and say, hey, look, this is a different way of looking at landscapes that has more to do with the plants and less to do with whether they identify as being members of Massachusetts or Connecticut or Rhode Island. Bringing a little bit of a little lesson in from ecology, I talk about plant succession. And so plant succession is this process by which open space, so maybe a former agricultural field, transitions to a forest. It might take 200 years, but it's a relatively well understood and relatively orderly process with plants. The first ones that move in to these sort of situations are ones that are shade intolerant, And they've evolved to be aggressive. They've evolved to spread via rhizomes, to make prodigious amounts of seed, and to cover ground. And they will then provide the shade for smaller trees, and earlier, so what we call pioneer trees like eastern red cedar or gray birch to move in. They create more shade, and then slowly over time, the plant community transitions over to more shade tolerant and eventually, mature canopy-sized trees. So what do you learn from this? Well, in the book, I use the example of goldenrods. We have a lot of wonderful goldenrods in New England. The kinds that you find in old agricultural fields are very ill-suited for small gardens. They're the kind of plants that some people might even label as invasive native plants. But it's not their fault. They evolved to cover space. And so if you know that about them, then you won't choose Canada goldenrod, for example, for a smaller garden. Canada goldenrod is an outstanding plant, has lots of wildlife value, but it needs room to move and to spread on its own. So it's not suited for that. There are other goldenrods that behave much more nicely. They form a clump. They seed in very slowly. They may be more shade tolerant and dry shade tolerant, which I know are other tough conditions that many gardeners face. So learning a little bit about plant succession, and I tried to include this as much as I could into the plant descriptions themselves, was important. Really throughout the book, there's a very common thread that is woven through a lot of the text, and that is that these plants are home for lots of life. And so welcoming life into your garden is as easy as having three-dimensional space, so having tree cover, having a shrub layer, and a ground cover layer. And so I would argue, why have mulch when you can have plants that cover the ground? And letting the leaves lay where they fall in the spring is great, in the fall rather, is great, because that leaf litter is home for queen bumblebees, caterpillars that will turn into butterflies, a whole host of organisms that are either blown away or raked up and bagged up when we're too quick to tidy things. And it doesn't mean that you have to leave your leaves everywhere, but consider having leaves as mulch in your garden beds. It's free. You don't even have to pay for it. You just have to rake it and spread it yourself. So really the point here is that we have to move a little bit beyond gardens as purely being things that are aesthetic and pretty to look at, and really embrace the idea that they have to be ecologically functioning as well. And this is where you have, you begin to kind of grapple with this wonderful, long running, I mean, we're talking millions of years here, long running relationships that plants have with insects, and particularly with pollinators. And while non-native plants will certainly support some insect life, they're not completely devoid of it, no other plants will come nearly close to supporting as much insect life as native species do. Many of our pollinators and the things that eat our plants, so caterpillars and other things, for example, have what amount to dietary restrictions. So they can only survive if they have the right kind of pollen or the right kind of leaf to eat. And so it's really important that we begin designing and using plants with their benefit in mind, as well as enjoying the plant's intrinsic beauties in their own. So from the pollinator's perspective, maintaining a good pollinator diversity is really reliant upon species diversities of plants. In other words, the more different kinds of plants that you have, the more plant-pollinator interactions there can be, and that increases the availability for these plant-based foods and shelters and nests and all the different stages in trophic levels in life. So our little chipmunk friend here really needs the fact that the seeds that he eats are pollinated by the insects that come from the plants that surround him. And just in the same way that the red-tailed hawk here, who I captured disemboweling a squirrel, really needs all the things that make sure there's enough squirrels around for her to be able to survive. So all of these things are really connected. That's kind of the point here. So let me back up and say that supporting pollinators is a really popular and easy way in which to get into using native plants. When we look at our bee population here in the Northeast, nearly a quarter of all bees, and so there's about 400 some species of bees in the Northeast of the United States, which is pretty astounding, of which the honeybee is one of those, okay? And many of them are small, many of them are solitary nesting, and many of them, about a quarter of them, are specialists. In other words, they're the ones with the dietary restrictions. They have this specific plant that they need in order to fulfill their nutritional, their own nutritional needs, so they can reproduce and survive. They are solitary nesting, which means that they're active excuse me, for shorter periods, and tend to be much more sensitive to things like climate change and shifts in blooming patterns and timing of blooms. So supporting these is really incredibly crucial. And these plants will also support all your generalist pollinators as well. So you're really getting a twofer here when it comes to pollinator support. So I'm going to show you a number of different plants here. Not all of them are profiled in the book because I had to stop at 235. If it was up to me, it would have been 500 plants. But in the aster family here, we have a lot of choices of things that are great for not only specialists, but for generalists as well. So things like fleabanes, asters, tick seeds, black-eyed Susans, sunflowers, blazing stars, even thistles, sneezeweeds, ironweeds, more asters. We've got lots of wonderful asters in the state here. And did I mention goldenrods? Yes, we have lots of goldenrods. Many of these are great garden-worthy species. Things like Joe Pye weeds down in the bottom are all really wonderful because of their ability to support such a wide array of wildlife. Bone sets, groundsels. If you need some structure, in the heath family, we've got a number of really wonderful shrubs, all of your deciduous azaleas. Many of them are also incredibly fragrant. Evergreens like really great rosebay, rhododendron, mountain laurels, huckleberries, winterberries. Who doesn't like picking their own blueberries from their own garden? And cranberries as well. And even the state flower of Massachusetts, our trailing arbutus, falls into this category. So these are all really wonderful plants, not only for the gift of fruit that they provide for us, but because they support such a great amount of life. Spotted horse mints. For shade lovers, you've got bishop's wort and foam flower. And violets. I really love violets. They come in lots of different colors. They're very unobtrusive. They fill in all the little places that are sometimes hard to grow in between other plants. And if they're ever too exuberant, they're very easy to edit out. So violets are fantastic. Here are some nectar plants that have, for bees that have short tongues. Again, so you're looking at a lot of the milkweeds. Nectar plants for long-tongued insects, so things that have long tubular shape or long nectar spurs, all really wonderful plants. And one of my favorites from the book here is a little montage to show that pollinators aren't just all pretty bees and butterflies and moths. They also include some pretty nasty looking flies, a cicada killer, even a daddy longleg I found on this one particular clematis vine, all drawn to this plant because of the copious amounts of resources that it has. And afterwards, it produces these wonderful fluffy seed heads, which I then later on learned that goldfinches use to line their nests. So a really wonderful a circle of life here with all of these pollinators and these plants. Lawn care is big business, $105 billion a year. The USDA estimates half of the average household water use goes to water lawns. There also are absolutely drenched in fertilizers that are unnecessary and pesticides that are unnecessary. And so there's lots of good suggestions in the book here for ways to encourage and welcome diversity in the interior lawn. So how about those violets, for example? You can let them flower in the spring and then you can mow over them. It's totally fine. Your lawn does not have to look like a putting green. So consider reducing your lawn. One of the other things that I think distinguishes this book is that I only recommend species instead of cultivars of natives. And the reason being is that I think that no matter how many pretty plants or improvements that humans have sought to create, which are what cultivars are, they're cultivated varieties of native plants where humans have had a hand in breeding them and selecting for them for different characters. Nobody can improve on Mother Nature's design in terms of the evolutionary relationships with insects. They also have a great deal more genetic diversity than many of the cultivars do. So if you can find them, please consider adding and embracing and welcoming some of those into your gardens. I also recognize that most of what you can find out in the nursery are cultivars, which is also fine. It's okay to do that too. The book has lists in it, which I really love. I love lists. They're great to kind of look down and say, oh, I'm looking for drought tolerant plants or evergreen natives or shrubs that might spread or sucker if I need to compete with some invasives that I've just removed. I also have a list of host plants for caterpillars and moths. And this is important because native plants produce and host a lot of different caterpillar and moth species. 96% of our songbirds need caterpillars in order to successfully raise a brood of chicks in the springtime. And so where are they going to get all of those caterpillars? There was a really delightful study done that showed that a pair of Carolina chickadees, in order to raise a brood of 5 chicks, needs somewhere between 7,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to do that. And that's a lot of caterpillars. It's a lot of trips back and forth to the nest. And so you really have to have plants that are going to support that volume of insects. And again, native plants are your answer. In the plant profiles, we have these wonderful little icons that we worked on including that indicate whether or not the plant is used by birds for food, shelter, to seed dispersal, nesting, whether they support native pollinators, they support butterflies, whether it's a larval host for a butterfly or moth species. And then the frog is to say, hey, you know what, there's other mammals and amphibians and reptiles that also make use of these plants. So don't forget about supporting us as well. So a sample for you here are 2 chokeberries, red chokeberry and black chokeberry, have all of the icons. They're real wonderful 4-season plants with beautiful flowers in the springtime, nice foliage in the summer, berries in the fall, and good fall color and good structure, and red leaf buds and those sorts of nice little details for the winter landscape. And I really tried in all of the individual plant descriptions to highlight some ecological value that the plant has, which is again a theme that is really woven through most of it here. In the section on vines, we talk about how you can use vines to screen unsightly views, hiding things like garbage bins and compost bins and so forth, and that all these vines are a real boon for resources and local wildlife, and that if you wait long enough, you might even find a nest or 2 hidden in the tangle. The largest group profiled by far is the wildflowers, because they are diverse. They grow in a lot of different light conditions, soil types, different kinds of habitats. And I really encourage folks to make that connection and go out and try to see some of these plants in the wild and see how they grow, with whom they grow, and all that information just by observing them can really be beneficial for you as a home gardener. I also included annuals. Many folks were surprised to learn that we actually do have a number of real true annuals in our flora. Many of the things that we consider annuals, like petunias and marigolds and begonias and sort of bedding plants, are actually perennials in tropical climates. They just aren't cold hardy up here. But we have a lot of wonderful ones, and they can be introduced as seed or as plants. They will most certainly flower the very first year because they only get 1 year to do it. And then the hope is that they seed themselves around, and maybe they fill in a little gap in between plantings, or they pop up in a nice place. And if there's too much, or if it's not in the right place, they're very easy to edit out as well. So annuals are really fantastic. I want to leave you with a few thoughts here about the use of native plants as really being something that's very forward-looking. I managed to get a picture of my first son in the book here, and I really think about this a lot when I look at this picture, because he's going to inherit the earth after we're done with it. And whatever I can do to make sure that it is as wild and as beautiful as I found it to be when I was a child, I'm going to do everything in my power to do that. And to end the talk, I'm going to leave you with just a quick reading of two passages that I think are amongst my favorites in the book, which is to say that, using native plants is not an effort or an attempt to recreate conditions of the past. It's a very forward-thinking act. And it's an act of compassion, because we're really looking to help the remaining flora and fauna survive in a very uncertain and fast-changing world. For those folks that say using only natives or only species is limiting or elitist, I would say it doesn't hold up unless you're only gardening for yourself. And that recognizing that the situation that the world is in now requires a degree of courage to face those challenges and ask yourself about what's really most important. What do I value most? Is it a clean and tidy lawn, or is it one that supports wildlife and is part of a larger ecosystem? And when viewed through that lens of value, you can see that using natives, it isn't a shackle, it's actually an act of liberation. And it shows that you place value in the ability for future generations to take advantage of the same benefits and privileges of biodiversity that we and our ancestors have enjoyed. So with that, I would say thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
So Uli, wonderful job as expected. Let's take 15 minutes of questions from the audience. Folks, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A. I will monitor the chat box, but please try to type your question into the Q&A box. First question comes from an anonymous attendee, and I'll pretty much bottom line it for you. She asks, what do you do if the native species for your area just aren't attractive?
Well, so I would say that the reason people find mop heads attractive is because most of those flowers are sterile and they just hang on the plant for a long, long period of time. And it gives the impression of actually being in bloom for much longer than it actually is. And the native one that you're talking about here actually produces fertile flowers to which the insects are attracted. I would say there are a number of different cultivars and selections of smooth hydrangea arborescens, or hydrangea radiata are two other good ones for the southeast that you might consider. There's one that I grew at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden that's called Total Eclipse, is the name of the cultivar, and it was fantastic and absolutely covered in bees when it was in flower, and I thought just as attractive as any of the mop heads. So maybe you just need to find that happy middle ground in accepting and looking out, or seeking out rather, an attractive cultivar of a native, as opposed to the mop heads, which are really bred just to have lots and lots of sterile flowers that really provide nothing for your local landscape.
Susan asks, which plant identification app do you recommend?
Well, I'm on the fence about these, to be truthful. I don't use one, mostly because I'm also of an era that remembers pre-cell phone days, and making payphone calls and all that. And so I learned my plants with an actual field guide and following keys. And I think the advantage of that is that you get to learn the plant in a much more intimate way, rather than pointing your phone at it and taking a picture and saying, "Oh, tell me what this is." I do think there are some good sort of community-based resources out there, and the one that I would recommend is iNaturalist. And so iNaturalist is really fantastic, and there's a lot of people that post images to iNaturalist that are sort of collectively or crowd ID'd, and it helps researchers, particularly if you're out in the woods, to know where plants are at any one given moment or time. There are a few other ones that some folks have suggested, but I'm going to stick with those two: iNaturalist and the old-fashioned field guide. I think there's no better way to learn plants than to actually look at them and look at them carefully, and not just through a picture.
All right, a different Susan asks, can the native plants stand up against some of the invasives that are everywhere in a garden?
Some can and some cannot. And again, I think that the trouble with invasive plants is that they don't have the same kind of checks and balances in terms of things that eat them. They tend to be more tolerant of disturbance. So that can come in the form of, mowing. Gardening is an active disturbance, or, maybe from when your house was built and they mowed down or cut down a forest and brought in other things, and stuff has been established in that way. I think that the most successful way without using pesticides is to try to remove the invasives and to immediately follow up by planting native plants that can spread and can compete. And so again, you're going to have to make some decisions about do you really want something that's going to spread and compete in your garden? Because if all you're looking for are plants that are going to make a clump and stay put, they're likely not going to be able to survive against the more rampant invasives that are out there.
A nice comment from Elena, who says, I bought the ebook version of your new book as soon as I learned you'd be speaking to us. I think I'm going to buy the hard copy version as well. Thank you. I have some digging up and rearranging to do.
Thank you.
So, Uli, let's try to go quickly through some of these. We have a lot of folks in the chat asking, is such and such a plant a native plant or not? So we'll kind of do a lightning round here. I don't expect you to go through all 235, but Jeanette is wondering, are daisies a native plant?
So the oxeye daisy that people see everywhere, the classic daisy with the yellow center, is not a native. It was introduced with the Europeans a long time ago. And similarly, the orange daylily that you see everywhere is also not a native. It's native to Europe and Asia.
Great. And the daylily question was from Karen, I believe. Let me see here. I thought there were a bunch more. Diane asks, are sunflowers considered native to our area?
Some are, but if you're thinking about, the really large ones that you might see in a farm field, those tend to be cultivated ones from somewhere else. But we have maybe 6 or 7 species of sunflower. There are a couple that will actually grow in dry shade as well, which are really wonderful. But they tend to have slightly smaller blooms and not the really larger ones that people think of when they think of sunflowers.
Maria and Dennis ask, are elderberries native to the northern New England states?
Absolutely. And they're delicious, and they're all in flower right now. So definitely, if you know of a good spot, keep your eye on it and try to get those berries before the birds do.
An anonymous attendee asks, are native plants dangerous to domesticated pets?
So we do have a couple of lilies, for example, and I do know that lily pollen is toxic to pets. For the most part, no, unless your pet is like actively eating the plants or eating the flowers. But there are a few that again, if you consult the SPCA websites and so forth for poisonous plants in regards to pets, they can tell you what to avoid. But not across the board.
Yep. Sorry, Uli. Loring asks, do you have any recommendations for how to introduce the idea of native plants in a condominium setting with a well-established traditional landscaping approach?
Well, I would suggest starting off small if you can. So rather than proposing a full-scale redo of the whole landscape. And I would also try to find, again, you'll probably have more success looking for cultivars of natives that are, for better word, sort of short and tidy. All right. Because I think those sorts of things are going to go over better in introducing people into the idea of natives than necessarily, a wildflower meadow or something like that. In terms of selling points, again, the condominium landscape doesn't exist in a bubble, and it has just as much opportunity to support local wildlife as a residential home or even a local park does. And so the importance part is that everybody tries to do a little bit to support that. And by supporting and by putting these plants in, you might see more bees, more pollinators. If you choose things that are host plants for butterflies, for example, that's a good way to draw it in. And also to say that because of the amount of insects that they support, you're also going to draw more bird life to the condo. And while I can't begrudge the wren that wakes me up at 5 a.m. At my house, I'm glad that he's here. And he's here because there's lots of native plants.
So I'm going to combine two questions. Kate asks, should we consider the impact of climate change when choosing our plants? And if so, how? And a related question from Amy, who writes, given what you were saying about the uncertainty of climate change, is there what looks like shifts in native species? Will today's native species continue to thrive in our areas? And have these plants' areas of growth been enduring and truly native over time?
So it's a pretty big topic. So I'll try to summarize or abridge my comments a little bit. So I think that we don't necessarily need to start thinking of sourcing plants from the South now to get ahead of what we think Massachusetts will look like in 20 years or from 50 years from now. I think that climate change is not only about things moving north and south and about warmer winters and hotter summers. It also involves shifts in precipitation patterns. And so scientists who track this are seeing shifts in plant species moving east and west in response to things getting wetter and drier, just as much as we're seeing slowly things moving north, or things that, for example, a plant that only lives on the top of Mount Greylock right now. When things get too hot, it has nowhere else to go. So it'll get squeezed off the top of the mountain, although it may still exist further north in Vermont or in New Hampshire. So that is part of the complexity of the question. I think the real answer lies in making sure that we have enough genetic diversity in our local plant life as possible, because that's going to be the key to allowing it to adapt to whatever the future holds for us. How long has our flora been in place here is really a question of time and context. If you go back long enough, most of New England was underneath of an ice sheet. So there really wasn't anything here 15,000 years ago. And then as the glacier receded, what came in would have looked like northern Canada now. And then that moved north as well, and things from the south moved in. But we're talking about a time frame of 10,000 years or longer for these plant communities to migrate. What I think makes this question particularly intriguing and even more complex now is that we as humans have introduced plants from not only other parts of the world, but also from other parts of the country into New England. And so perhaps another question or another food for thought is, how long do we have to wait for the plant from the Southeast that you planted that's now escaped into the local woods and established there? How long do we have to wait until that becomes a member of our flora? And I think the real reason to really kind of drill down to it even further is to say that any kind of definition of a flora has to be considered as fluid and always changing depending on the time frame within which you're considering it.
So Uli, let's take 5 more questions. I want to acknowledge we've hit 8 o'clock. Uli's answered about 10 audience questions. There's about 30 to go, but we're only going to take 5 more. I will do my best here. Uli, thank you for being generous with your time.
Of course.
So Krista asks, we just moved from Colorado into our new house in Wilmington, Massachusetts last week and have started ripping up the back lawn to put in a decent sized, edible pollinator native garden. What plants would you recommend for easy propagation that won't break the bank? And do you know of any local groups that you would recommend for plant swaps and plant purchases?
Well, so I would look into seeing if there are local pollinator pathway groups, because they're oftentimes hosting plant sales and so forth. Garden clubs are also great sources for people to share plants, and garden clubs need more members, and they need more people to get involved in that and to carry that really long and important history of a gardening community forward. So I think they're really great folks to get involved with. I would say that if you have space to cover, consider plants that are going to get a spread. I don't know what your yard looks like, so I can't recommend specific things, but things that will spread on their own will help you in the long run, rather than things that you'd have to wait and divide and then spread around that way. It's hard to say. What I can do as a follow-up in the chat, I'm going to put my email address in, and then if folks have other questions that obviously folks do and we haven't gotten a chance to answer, I'm happy to try to field some of those via email if you have specific questions about recommendations and so forth. That's probably the best way for our recent transplants from Colorado, for me to give some more specific information. And that way I might be able to field a few more questions here.
That's great, Uli. Great thinking. An anonymous attendee asks, is there some place or some business in my area, the Lowell, Massachusetts area, that might have these native plants? I guess, do you have a recommendation as to where people in Mass should buy their native plants?
Well, there are not too many nurseries. I think that as far as nurseries that only carry native plants, there is Garden in the Woods in Framingham, the couple others that I mentioned, Blue Stem down in Norwell. But I think a lot of local garden centers will carry some natives here. I see in the chat somebody put in the Monarch Gardener in Ipswich sells only natives. So there are definitely other ones out there. But this actually brings up another good point. Also, Van Berkom Nursery, which they may be only wholesale, but if you do shop for plants, and particularly for native plants at garden centers, a couple of important questions to ask before you give them your credit card or cash. One, was this plant produced with any pesticides? This is incredibly important because I think that it's perhaps one of the cruelest ironies that people seek out native plants because they want to support insects and pollinators, and then don't realize that the plants have been treated with neonicotinoids or other pesticides that are poisoning the very organisms that you are trying to trying to support. So, and this is difficult to do, and I recognize this. If they can't give you a good answer, don't buy anything there. I know it's really hard to go to the nursery and confront it with all these beautiful plants and thinking of the possibilities for your own garden. To walk away empty-handed takes a lot of willpower. But I think it's important that the nursery industry also begins to understand that people want plants that weren't grown with pesticides. And then secondly, if they can tell you anything about where the plant is from, that would also be really great. But that is a little bit harder. And I see here in the chat, there's lots of other great suggestions of nurseries that carry some native plants as well. So there's definitely good stuff out there. With that, let me just say thank you all for joining. If you have any other further questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I will do my best to answer in a timely fashion. And thank you for all your support with the book. And thank you, Robert, for the opportunity to present about my work.
Yeah, no, thank you, Uli. Wonderful job. Folks, look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to a feedback survey, a link to this recording. I'll include Uli's email address. There'll be a link to purchase a copy of Uli's book, and there'll be some information about some other virtual gardening programs that are happening this summer. I want to thank Wellesley Books for being our bookstore partner. I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Corning Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event. I want to thank the 17 other libraries, who I will thank in the email tomorrow, for partnering with Tewksbury tonight. And most importantly, I want to thank Uli for giving a wonderful presentation, and for all of you for watching. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. Thanks again, Uli. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Okay. There we go. Great. Bye-bye.